Hi, this is Boki, and today I'm going to be reviewing Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. So I'm going to be doing this review as part of my DiverseAThon participation. DiverseAThon is a readathon going on from September 12th to the 19th, and it's basically to encourage people or challenge them to read books with more diversity, as well as authors that reflect different identities that maybe are not represented as commonly in a lot of popular media. I'll kind of bounce back and forth between talking about Nimona and reviewing it, as well as kind of talking about how I think it corresponds to a lot of the ideas that to me are important when discussing diversity. Nimona is a graphic novel. You can see pictures. Nimona, I believe, was a webcomic originally, and then it got turned into the book. And the book was nominated for an Eisner Award. It was on the long list for the National Book Award, so it's gotten a lot of recognition. And the story is about Nimona, a shapeshifter, who decides that she wants to be a sidekick for the evil Lord Blackheart, who's kind of this mad scientist, was originally working for the force of good, and then his arm got chopped off, and he decided that, well, he basically couldn't work for the good guys anymore, and he kind of went on to do his own thing. And so as they're working together, basically they kind of go up against the Institute for Law Enforcement, the good guys, and over the course of the story you learn more about Nimona and her shape-shifting abilities and kind of her mysterious past. You also kind of start to realize that the good guys might not be so good, the bad guys might not be so bad. They end up kind of protecting a lot of people over the course of the book. So I have had this book sitting on my bookshelf for a while. I bought it at, I think, an indie comic expo in Boston. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to read for DiverseAThon, I kind of first started with what I have lying around that I haven't read yet. So I was not quite sure if this would fit, so I decided to kind of, cheat a little, start my reading a day early and just see if it would work. The reason that I first was thinking about it was Nimona here, she is, as you can see, she is not like your standard slender, like, female protagonist. She's got some punch, and I think that's pretty awesome. And especially with like fantasy or comics, a lot of times the girls are depicted as pretty slim, and sure, it's supposedly to, like, I don't know, make them warriors, but like, they really don't need to all be, you can fight people with a sword or whatever, like, without being skinny. The rest of the characters are often depicted as being, like, in the very, like, aesthetically as just being very long characters, whereas Nimona, by contrast, is very kind of short and stout. And I think that's supposed to distinguish her, but I think it's also kind of a clear choice of what the character is supposed to look like. I'll get into a little bit more of that later, but over the course of the story, there are some other things that I think were kind of important to consider as well in terms of diversity. Like I mentioned, one of the characters does have his arm cut off. Kind of interesting implications for how that leads him to his current state. He is, like, technically the bad guy, and that is fraught with a lot of potentially problematic things, but I think there's a very clear thing in the story where it's not that he is a bad guy, it's that people treated him as a bad guy, and that's why he's being villainized. Like, he's not necessarily a villain so much as he's being villainized. There is also some suggestion, actually I don't think it's even suggestion, I think it's pretty clearly canon, it's just not done in a very overt way, that two of the male characters are in love with each other or have been in love with each other. So on to the review. When I first started reading it, I love the art style. When I first started reading it, when you kind of just like are getting introduced to the characters, I found it a little bit slow to get into them. But I think it did a really good job of melding the humor with kind of the more painful aspects of all of the characters' backstories. And by the end of the book, I thought that she had done a really good job of building all of these characters up and really fleshing them out in ways that are sad but also very hopeful. Like, you really get a sense of how their relationships have changed over time and how that's impacting their current state. The world of Nimona is also really cool, like that medieval sort of peasantry feudal system world where there are knights in shining armor, but it's also complemented by a lot of technology, so it's like kind of a weird mishmash. There is a newscaster, for example. There is crazy, like, inventions taking place. So there is like kind of this cool like meshing of the two, and it's just very naturally done too. Like, for some reason I was just like, oh yeah, sure, like a newscast in, medieval times, that totally makes sense. And I just thought that world was incredibly fun to see as well. There were some issues for me with like the true villains of the story, kind of understanding why they were making the decisions that they were making. I don't know that everything there was completely fleshed out, but I think by the end of the book, I also didn't really care. That was not really what I was reading it for at that point. Like I said, the real thing for me at the core of the story was the relationships between the characters, and in particular, the relationship between Nimona and Lord Blackheart, because in the beginning, they start out with like, she's kind of this pesky sidekick, and he's like, what are you doing? Why are you here? And she's like, yeah, I'm gonna be here. And she seems like very lighthearted. She seems like she's just very impulsive. She's gonna do what she wants to do. And by the end of the book, you start to understand why she is the way she is, but you also realize how much of a contrast it is to her backstory. I got to this point where I was reading it on the T, and I just like almost missed my stop because I was just like almost at the end, and I was just so invested in finding out what had happened to her and what was going to happen to her. Yeah, I really love this book. I think if you like fantasy books of any kind, I think this is a great book to read. I think it's perfect if you're like a fan of like YA fantasy. The world of this book is so cool. If you love comics, I think this is a great comic book to read, or a great graphic novel, comic book, whatever. And if you do like Nimona, I also recommend reading some of Noelle Stevenson's other works. For example, Lumberjanes is also kind of similar in that it's like this world that seems almost normal, except like there's this weird set of kooky things happening in the background. Highly recommend that as well. I do also want to talk about kind of how this reflects different or what this book made me think of in terms of diversity. And I think the first thing that I think of, especially because what drew me to the book was very much what the main character looked like, is that a thing that I like about comics, but that can also make it kind of fraught, is that unlike like prose novels, comics are a place where you have to make any of your diversity in terms of like visible traits very clear. Like it is very much textual. So a lot of times with books, you can write a character and you can leave their race ambiguous, and you can interpret in different ways. Except the problem is, a lot of us are programmed to see those characters default as white. This is something that I'm totally guilty of, and that's an issue that comes up a lot in terms of like how fandom interacts with those books, how like adaptations take place, casting characters who could be, any race, they kind of oftentimes just go with white. Comics, you don't have this issue, right? Like you have to, if your girl is a fat character, you have to show it. Comics do have a lot of issues with diversity. I think that there are some writers who are putting a lot of effort into changing that. Writers like Brian Michael Bendis, Kelly Sue DeConnick, Gail Simone. Those are just a few off the top of my head, but there are other writers. They are very much thinking about ways to bring more diversity, or it would also be nice if there were more diversity within the comic book world, not just in terms of the characters, but in terms of the creators, right? More like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Roxane Gay, like bringing in, non-white writers. I think that's a huge thing. I did a tag video about diversity, and I basically referred to a bunch of comics that reflect different types of diversity. So I will link to that below in case you're interested in finding comics that bring diversity in different ways. Kind of talking more specifically about Nimona, one of the things that I appreciated is that Nimona is a shapeshifter. She can take on any form that she wants. She's pretty good at it. And she uses it to change her own appearance. She uses it to change her haircut. The thing that she never really uses it for is to make herself slimmer. And I think that's pretty awesome, right? Like in the X-Men movies, who does Miss Day choose to look like? Rebecca Romijn and Jennifer Lawrence, like these tall, skinny, blonde, beautiful women. And Nimona does not do that. That is not the image that she is choosing to take. Maybe that like she could, but she just like, no, I want to look like I've got thick thighs. Like that's what she wants. And I think that's like a part of the way that her story like manifests aesthetically, that I think is a pretty cool reflection of her own like internal self. And one thing I read was that Noelle Stevenson, she kind of envisioned Nimona based on the fact that when she cosplays, she liked to cosplay more as male characters than female, and so Nimona is deliberately set up to be a more butch character, which again is not something that you see, I think, as main characters in fantasy stories. I think a lot of times our fantasy heroines, they might be strong and badass, but they usually either have long hair or it's like shaved off to represents some sacrifice, but she still at her core like got a lot of femininity attached to her through different visual choices. And Nimona is very much kind of a rejection of that. So she is like, she's got hairstyles that are not like, you know, the bald sacrifice or the long flowing locks. She doesn't look like she belongs in a painting. She's very much like her own, she's very much a specific character, and she doesn't look like she could be played by, I don't know, like Kristen Stewart or Jennifer Lawrence as they stand right now. Like, they would have to put work into looking like her. It definitely was a challenge to my own conception, because while I like to think myself as a body positive person, that doesn't mean that I am necessarily immune from conceptions about what women should look like in media. I definitely do have my own kind of biases, and they're bullshit, right? Like, they don't mean anything. Like, there's no reason for me to really have them. There's no reason for characters to look a certain way unless I'm just being full of shit. I mean, Nimona does not look like those characters who I feel like I've conditioned myself or allowed myself to be conditioned to find beautiful, to find worthy of love and respect. She does not look like that, and I think it's cool to have books where like female characters do not follow into those lines for that reason. Yeah, I love Nimona. I thought it was great. If you've read it, let me know, or if any of the things I've talked about are interesting you, definitely let me know. I would love to talk more about these ideas. I'm looking forward to more DiverseAthon stuff going on, both other people's videos and kind of talking some more about some of my ideas.